This is Professor Pete Alexander with the Winning at Business and Life podcast, where business leaders share their insights. It is 6 questions in 7 minutes because successful business leaders are busy and rarely have more time to spare. So let's get to it. Question number one, in a few sentences, please tell me who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm David Covey, and I'm one of Stephen R. Covey's sons, his third son. And I think you had a prior guest, my brother, Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote The Speed of Trust. So, and then I have my own business, which I've had for the last 10 years. It's been awesome. It's a global licensing business where we help content providers go global with their content through licensing. And so that's what I do. And prior to that, I was at Franklin Covey, the company that my father helped build for about 16 years, both in the U.S. and international roles.
Well, David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Question number two, what is something that makes you smile and or laugh about working in your industry?
Well, I mean, I think that here we are with our third crisis in the last 19 years. We had the crisis of 01, 02, what people refer to as the Great Recession in 08 and 09. And now we have this, COVID, this global pandemic. And what I find humorous is that in every one of these, it's not like we haven't had a warning or a rodeo to try, is that, some businesses are flat-footed and they don't want to change and they kind of stay where they're at, and others are a really, really good job at pivoting and changing and adapting. And I marvel and I kind of smile at those who are not able to adapt and change and evolve.
I love that. It's so true. I completely agree with you. Question number three. I have a fictitious book with all the answers for business. What chapter would you think most companies should read?
I think the chapter that I would recommend would be about reinventing yourself, kind of similar to the theme that I talked about before.
Mhm.
And I think that a lot of companies are enamored with their success or even their past successes, and they become complacent. And so I think that we have to constantly reinvent ourselves, and businesses need to reinvent themselves, countries as well. So I think it's something that all of us need a reminder. And a lot of times we let force of circumstances that force us to change rather than the force of conscience. Knowing changing before you have to change is really what it's all about. So I think that would be the chapter I would emphasize.
I like that too. And if you change before you have to, you avoid, I would imagine, a lot of stress, et cetera, as
Oh,
well, right? Because you're being proactive more rather than reactive.
Exactly. I have a friend that doesn't like to work out,
Mhm.
exercise. And he says, anytime I feel like working out, I lay down until the feeling goes away. and of course, that's not a good formula for staying fit and keeping your body fit and all that. But, obviously, if you take that to the extreme, when is this person going to change? When they have a heart attack, and then what do your options look like, when you're in a health crisis like that?
Mhm.
So absolutely, for our own lives, for our own business, we need to evolve and adapt and change and reinvent ourselves constantly. And
Mhm.
in fact, everything changes so fast that if you're not reinventing yourself every 5 years now, you become obsolete
Mhm.
very, very quickly. My
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah, yeah, and I would agree with you there. And it's not a good thing to be sitting there being the one that is obsolete. My
Yeah.
goodness. Question number four. Other than the generic work harder, have a great attitude, and care for customers, what advice or insight would you give to other business leaders?
So the insights, I have three insights. So one is great work comes about through relationships. I just finished reading Robert Iger's book, The Ride of a Lifetime. He was the CEO of Disney, for many years. He actually retired right before COVID. But
Mm.
it's a good time to retire. But I love that. I really believe that business and life is really about relationships, and our job is to try to create great relationships because we get things done through relationships, through other people. And also, I think we need to repair. the broken relationships. I love in the book where he talks about how he had to repair the relationship with Roy Disney, who was the nephew of Walt, who was, causing all kinds of havoc in terms of his dissatisfaction with the company. Well, he repaired that relationship. Steve Jobs at Pixar, when he took over, the Pixar relationship was in shambles. There was no relationship with Steve Jobs. He built that relationship, which enabled Disney to buy Pixar. And then, of course, the George Lucasfilms example where he built, an amazing relationship with George to where he was able to even let go. He had his, Star Wars was his baby. He wasn't going to give it to anybody, but he was willing to give it to Robert Iger and to Disney because of the relationship that he had. So that would be my number one. The second one is I would say that we need to have more successful failures. I think a lot of times as people and as leaders, we're not willing to fail enough. And I have a quote by Jeff Bezos that I love. It says, one area, talking about Amazon, where I think that we are especially distinctive is failure. I believe we're the best place in the world to fail. We have plenty of practice. And failure and invention are inseparable twins. To invent, you have to experiment. And if you know in advance that it's going to work, it's not an experiment. So I think that, what's made Amazon a terrific company and Jeff Bezos a great leader is their willingness to fail. He calls it successful failure because you don't want to fail and just keep repeating the same mistakes. You need to learn from those mistakes. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, I would just say this idea of never settling, in your work. I think that we have massive disengagement, as you know, not only in the United States, but globally. And why is that? There are really four parts to us as human beings. We have and for us in a job, we want to be paid fairly. We want to be able to have our mind utilized. We want to have our heart engaged. That's the passion part of it. And we want to have our spirit also contributing. And the spirit is really about, making a difference. Steve Jobs called it, putting a dent in the universe. And I think a lot of times we settle. And today, with all the options that are out there with companies, none of us should ever settle in our work. And I have a great Steve Jobs quote that he says, the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. And as with all matters of the heart, you'll know it when you find it. Anyway, those would be my three things.
They're all three are so powerful. I really appreciate you sharing them. And it brings up so many different inspirational thoughts. So thank you so much. Question number 5, what other business leader like yourself would you like to acknowledge and invite to be on my podcast?
Yeah. So I read a lot. That's one of my, business practices. I try to read like 3 or 4 books a week. In the month of April, I set this crazy goal to read 500 pages a day. Wow. And I actually read like 33 books in that month. It wasn't good for my marriage for that month. I was reading like 8 or 9 hours a day. But I had set that goal. So there's 2 books that I have really been influenced by, and those are recommended to guests. One is a book called Unlearn by Barry O'Reilly. And it just talks about how we just need to unlearn what we've learned. And, so this is kind of the same theme of reinvention. The other book is by Donald Miller, who talks about building a story brand, has great advice on how to build your brand and how to market your brand. So I would say Barry O'Reilly and Donald Miller would be the 2.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for those referrals. I will reach out to them and see if we can get them on the show.
Yeah.
And our final question number 6, please tell me about your first job.
So my first professional job right out of college was working for Procter & Gamble. And I was a sales rep in Phoenix, Arizona. And I sold their paper products and their soap products and their food and beverage products. And it was, especially during the summer in Phoenix, it just becomes, people say, well, it's not a humid, the humidity is not there. Yeah. But, when you get to 122 degrees, it doesn't matter about whether the humidity is not fully at the same degrees. But it was an amazing experience. What I liked about it is is that I discovered this concept that I'm talking about, relationships. I found that if I could build great relationships with the grocery store managers, even if my presentation wasn't exactly how they wanted, or the economics weren't as good as they wanted, they would buy, because I had a good relationship with them. Whereas if I didn't have a good relationship, it was very, very hard to make any progress or any traction. Mm-hmm. I also felt like, are you kidding? I went for 4 years to do this, which was a lot of the work was, cutting in new products in the shelves, that Procter & Gamble had, bringing stuff out from the back room, building displays, end cap displays and all that. Mm-hmm. So part of me, it just felt like, 4 years of college for this, it felt like like a job that wasn't exactly expecting out of college, but I learned a lot, and I got some great experience.
Well, and I love how you mentioned about the fact that you had to build a relationship with the store managers too. Otherwise, you're not going to sell as much. And that just reinforces the power of relationships, because people buy from people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's, I think that's really one of the most underrated things. A lot of times people just think, well, I'm big, I have a lot of assets, with my company, and you can just do what we want. Yeah. You can, but ultimately, if you really want to be really, really successful, you've got to be able to have great relationships with people and companies, because if you don't, eventually you suffer. And I think that's one of the most underrated things in business.
Yeah, and I would agree 100% with you. So, David, thank you so much for being on the show. How can people find you?
So they can find me at David M.R. Covey. I have my own website, or my business, SM Covey. SM is my business partner, Stefan Mardix. And you can find me on, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. So pretty
perfect.
Easy. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, this is Professor Pete Alexander with the Winning at Business and Life podcast. Thanks for listening.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You bet.